it's been a good day together. The Hope Academy is just one model of many models, right? And so you could leave today just taking away one or two ideas, right? A part of what we've been talking about today, and that would be a good thing, right? that maybe there was just one really great new idea. Maybe you learned about the house system, right? That we do at Hope, and you thought, oh boy, that would be a great addition to what we're doing. So you might just take a part. You might have said, I really like the way you guys do it all, and I want to see what I can do to replicate what you're doing in our city. So you could take part. You could take as much of it as you can. Our philosophy is that freely we have received, right, and freely we'd like to give it away as best we can. And so I want you to just conclude by encouraging you to dream big, start small, and grow slow. Here's what I mean. Before I get to that, though, if I were to ask you, what is the biggest obstacle to the advance of the kingdom in any city or any neighborhood? Right? What's the biggest obstacle? Most of us would be tempted to look outward, right? We'd say, well, the decay of the culture is a huge obstacle, or the way school funding is set up is just an enormous obstacle that would hinder the advance of the kingdom, or whatever it might be, looking out that way. Can I ask you to reconsider that? Because I've come to believe that the greatest obstacle to the advance of the kingdom in my neighborhood is actually within me. It's really my unbelief in the promises of God that ultimately are the biggest obstacle to the advance of God's work in my city. Right? I mean, think about God's leadership profile. It's very different, isn't it, than a normal leadership profile, right? When you look at God's job descriptions, they're very different than the ones that we make, right? We make these 2 to 3 pages of impossible things that we're asking people to be, right? But God doesn't vet in the natural, right? He vets in the supernatural. And just to encourage you, right? We say around Hope Academy that God's done what He's done here not because of me, but in spite of me. And that's we really are honest. He's done it in spite of. And so in 1 Corinthians, Paul helps us to see that this is by God's design. This is his design to do it this way. So listen to God's leadership profile, right? He said, "But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of the world and the despised things and the things that are not to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before Him." Quite a job description, right? Foolish, weak, lowly, and despised. Right? God's not. That's His leadership profile, and I fit that to a max. Right? That is, and you do too. Right? Now, what's His design in that? His design is that at the end of the day, nobody would say, well, look what Nathan has done, right? Or, look what Steve has done, or look, right? It's to say, look what God has done. Isn't God amazing? That's what God's up to. He's up to do something in and through our lives that people say, isn't God incredible? That he would bring a people that would lay down their lives to bring that he really is who he said he is, and he'll do what he says he'll do. Right? That's the real qualification, and that's available to every one of us. Right? So, dream big. Right? In my over 30 years of ministry, I'd have to say that the biggest mistake in serving the Lord has been consistently underestimating God. Over and over and over, right? I have underestimated God because, like the book title, My God is Too Small. It's not the God of the Scriptures. It's the God that I've made him into, but made him into basically somebody who's just a little bit smarter, stronger, right, and able than the best of us. That's not God, right? God is God, and over and over I continue to plan and as if God was not who he said he was. And let me give you an example of that. When our school was about 6 years old, 5 or 6 years old, we had maxed out the church building that we were in. We had classes meeting in a janitor's closet at one point, and it was just an unsustainable thing. And we had been looking for years for what the next place was for the school, and couldn't find anything that was working. And finally, there was a photographic film processing factory nearby, and they had gone out of business when everything went digital. And so we were going to buy their factory and for $1.5 million, and then put another $1.5 million to convert it into a school that would serve about 150 kids. No gym, no cafeteria, no playground. It was just kind of a bare bones thing, and we assumed, well, that's what the Lord has given to us. That's our next step. And so we began to move ahead with that plan. And then one morning I got a call from our board president, and he said, "Russ, we've got a problem." I said, "Really? What's going on?" He said, "You won't believe this, but as the workmen were doing some soil sampling at the new building, they found arsenic in the soil." I said, "They found what?" "Arsenic." So across the street, there was a factory that made pesticides. And some of the arsenic that they used had contaminated other places nearby. And the only solution for this was to remove 6 feet in depth of the topsoil, to truck it away and to replace it at a cost of another $1 million, right? And I said, and so we had to abandon the project. We had told our parents, we had told everybody we were going to be doing this new thing. We had started to raise money for it. It all came to an end, right? And I began to despair about, Lord, what are you doing? What are you doing? And then the Lord brought this to mind. He said, whenever the Lord gives you a no, it's always because he's got a better yes. Trust me. And sure enough, right, 18 months later, we bought a 7-story former hospital that the public schools had put $44 million into to convert into a K-8 school for 600 students. They used it for 15 years, and then they sold it. They sold it to us, and one of our donors stepped up and bought this this building for hope. And we literally turned the key and walked into a completely ready school, all prepared for us. And we said, when God told Joshua that he was going to drive out the nations and give him cities he didn't build and vineyards he didn't plant, we always say, and school buildings you didn't renovate. Over and over and over, my problem is that I haven't dreamed big enough. God's always doing something bigger. But at the same time, I want to encourage you to start small. So dream big, but start small. So don't despise the days of small things. And one of the temptations at coming to a conference like this is when you hear about a school that's 17 years, a maturely developed school that's 17 years in development, you go, I could never do that, or that just seems way too big. And so don't compare yourselves with mature schools. It would be like a 5-year-old, right, despairing that he wasn't as strong as a 25-year-old, or as fast, or that a 5-year-old isn't supposed to be that strong or that fast, right? So there's a day of small things. One of the ways we think about what we're doing is that we're growing oaks of righteousness. Well, when you've got K1 and 2, all you've got are little saplings. You're a long way from having an oak of righteousness. But don't despair, because acorns become oaks if you stay with it long enough, right? And so today, we actually have acorns and oaks. And you will too, right? I mean, think of this. Think of a parenting analogy. God doesn't give brand new young parents 16-year-olds, does he? Right? He gives you little babies. That's by design. It's by design, right? But when you get 16 years later, you'll be prepared and mature and ready to handle a 16-year-old and a school of the kind of scale and size that like a Hope Academy is today. Don't despise the day of small things and getting started. Don't despise that it might only be helping a few people. You all know the old Starfish story, right? That little boy walking on the beach, and he's taking starfish that have washed up on the beach and throwing them back into the sea. And an old man comes alongside and said, "Little boy, stop for a moment. Stop what you're doing. Just look up ahead of you along the beach. There are thousands of starfish here. You're not going to make a difference." Right? The little boy stops. He picks up another one, and he says, "It'll make a difference to this one." And that's what we need to remember, right? That all these children are God's children. They all are infinitely valuable. That helping 1 or 2 or 5 or 35 is a gloriously meaningful, important, necessary thing that will have eternal consequences. Yeah, there might be 42,000 people in my district, and I'm only serving 475 of those students. But I'm serving 475 children whose lives are never going to be the same. Right? So dream big, start small. Grow slow. So here's another story. Before we started Hope Academy, my board president, Jeff, and I were at a retreat on the shores of Lake Huron. And we were thinking about what we're going to name the school. So we hadn't even named the school yet, and we decided to make a fire in the cabin that we were staying in. And so we started up this fire, and as it was going along, I stood up and went over to the fire, and I took 3 big logs, and I put them onto the fire. And guess what happened? Smothered it. The fire died out, right? And we said, you know what? This is a metaphor. This is a metaphor for Hope Academy, that we're going to take a grow slow approach. And there have been a couple of times during our experience where we violated our grow slow approach, and each time we did that, we almost sunk the school. Right? So there was a time when we started our middle school, and another time when we started our high school, where we said, in order to provide the kind of level of programming that most parents expect for a middle school or a high school, we've really got to have a critical mass of students to do that. And so we're going to kind of open the doors. And we brought in a large number of in that case it was middle school students, and later on it was high school students that didn't come up through our system. Because and in both cases it worked out terribly, and we almost sunk the school. It was analogous to the way a body, when you get an infection, right? You can tolerate a small infection, right, if you're a healthy body. But if you bring in a massive infection, which would happen, where students brought in their toxic school culture from elsewhere into our school, it almost killed the patient, right? The same is true with regards to the fundraising piece of what we're doing. In most schools, new students are additional revenue. In our schools, new students are another bill, right? Another $7,000 bill. So you can only grow at the pace that you can raise the money to serve those students. So that demands a kind of a grow slow type of an approach. And I know that all of us are impatient people and want to grow faster. But let me encourage you that we've benefited from a grow slow approach. So dream big, start small, grow slow. And lastly, let me just conclude by encouraging you to do something. Right? I told you earlier today about that time that I was in that church service and was encouraged to do something crazy with my life. And there was a piece of that at that moment where, of course, I was still wrestling with saying no. I had said no for so long, and during that moment, I felt as if the Lord was saying this: Russ, if you're not ready to trust me and move ahead with this, I'm ready to move on and find someone else who will. Now that was terrifying. That was terrible. That idea that my opportunity to respond to God's call in my life was coming to an end with this. Now, I don't know whether that would have been the end or not, but that was, at that moment, I felt so clearly that God was saying, I've called you and called you and called you, and if you're not ready to trust me, and that was the issue, you're not ready to trust me and do this, I'm ready to move on and find someone else who will. Because that's the only qualification that I'm looking for, right? And that was terrifying. And so do something, right? Let me just leave you with one scripture from the gospel, because I believe that this is a unique moment in time in our history, right? You remember early on in Jesus' ministry, he went to Nazareth and he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath. And they handed him the book of Isaiah. And he unrolled the scroll and he found in the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he's anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, and to set the oppressed free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." I believe with all my heart that our schools can do this more effectively than almost any other thing I can think of. Right? If I had the choice in terms of bringing this message to a neighborhood, an inner city neighborhood, and you said you can either plant a church or start a school, I think from what I know now, 95 times out of 100, I'd start the school first and then the church. Right? I don't think there's anything with the kind of promise and power to impact an inner city neighborhood with this kind of good news to the poor, freedom for the prisoners, sight for the blind, and freeing the oppressed than the kind of schools that we've talked about here today. And I think for many of us, if we won't do it, the Lord will move on and find some others who will, because He is determined to do it, to use this unique opportunity of this urban education crisis, that believers can in the power of the Spirit move into that and bring real hope and real change. Hope in God changes everything. And if we can be of any help to any of you who want to move in that direction, please let us know how we can help. Freely God has given, freely we will give whatever we can to help others to do that. So, well, it's 4:15. So is that's probably where we should maybe bring it to a close, huh? And Dan will be here. I'll be here. The Hope Academy staff will be here. If we can be of any further help, we'd love to do that. But blessings on you. Let me pray for us as we go. Jesus, we believe that you are still about proclaiming good news to the poor of our nation. You're still today about proclaiming freedom for the prisoners. You're still today about recovery of sight for the blind and setting the oppressed free. Lord, and I pray that you would use all of us in some way to do something that would be your instruments in the redemption of the families in our cities that are so on your heart.